a Civil Air Patrol aircrew running a training sortie over the western Chugach Mountains on the afternoon of March 14, 2025. Above the northern edge of Prince William Sound, logged a thermal anomaly on an exposed ridge slope that wasn't on that day's target list. A single bright return on the forward-looking infrared feed, sitting alone on bare rock above the snowline. What made the crew keep the camera on it wasn't the heat itself. Ridge rock exposed to a clear March sun runs warm most afternoons in this range. It was how the spot cooled once the aircraft looped back 40 minutes later for a second pass. The return had dropped in temperature at a rate the crew's own sensor operator flagged as inconsistent with the surrounding stone, which was still holding a slow, even afternoon warmth. This spot had already lost most of its heat. But the ridge itself is only the starting point. That slope sits close to the outer edge of the largest search and rescue grid ever flown in United States history. The 1972 search for a Cessna 310, carrying 2 sitting members of Congress, an aide, and a pilot, none of whom were ever found. Picture the terrain at that hour. Wind-scoured granite above treeline, the kind of exposed rock face that holds a view for miles in clear weather and disappears completely the moment low cloud moves in off the sound, which in this range can happen inside 20 minutes. This was not a sun-warmed boulder cooling on schedule with the rock around it. The surrounding stone hadn't lost comparable heat in the same window. It was not a game carcass either. Carcasses cool steadily and predictably without the sharper early drop this return showed. And it was not a sensor artifact from the aircraft's own systems, since the same anomaly registered on both passes 40 minutes apart, at the same fixed coordinates. The detail that doesn't resolve is the cooling curve itself. Exposed granite in this range loses heat slowly and evenly once the sun drops behind the ridgeline, the way a mass of solid stone does. This return lost most of its heat within minutes of the aircraft's first pass, then leveled off. Rock doesn't cool on that curve. Aluminum does. Where that ridge sits matters as much as what the sensor caught there. On October 16, 1972, a twin-engine Cessna 310 carrying House Majority Leader Hale Boggs, Alaska Representative Nick Begich, Begich's aide Russell Brown, and pilot Don Johns took off from Anchorage bound for Juneau on a campaign trip. The tower logged a routine check-in at 9:09 that morning. Nothing further was ever heard from the aircraft. What followed remains, by the numbers, the largest search and rescue operation in American history to that point. 40 military aircraft, 50 civilian planes, and a search area covering roughly 325,000 square miles logged across more than 3,600 hours of flight time over 39 days. The search was called off on November 24, 1972. No wreckage and no trace of any of the 4 men has been recovered in the more than 50 years since. It would be easy to file this as a settled case, a small plane lost to bad weather in mountains that swallow aircraft on a fairly regular basis. Filed, closed, accepted, nothing left to look at. That explanation survives a general knowledge of Alaska's accident record. It does not survive the specific finding of the National Transportation Safety Board, which closed its investigation in January 1973 without identifying a probable cause, citing a lack of physical evidence to support any single theory. An official verdict of unresolved, not an official verdict of understood. A closed file and a solved file are not the same document, and this one has only ever been the first. It would also be easy to assume that modern sensor technology succeeding where hundreds of aircraft failed in 1972 is itself implausible on its face. The 1972 search relied almost entirely on visual scanning from the air and ground reports in weather that grounded flights for days at a stretch. Forward-looking infrared of the kind flown today did not exist in a form usable for this kind of terrain search until decades later, and even once it did, it was rarely flown over ground this remote unless a specific mission called for it. A tool that didn't exist and a pass that was never flown can't be faulted for missing something in 1972. This isn't the same search looking harder. It's a different kind of search altogether, run over the same ground almost by accident. And it would be easy to assume a single sensor return, caught once, means nothing. Instrument noise, a stray reflection, an artifact of the aircraft's own equipment rather than the ground beneath it. That objection survives a single pass. It does not survive a second pass, 40 minutes later, at the same fixed coordinates, showing the same cooling pattern the surrounding terrain didn't share either time. The scale involved is difficult to hold in ordinary terms. A search area of 325,000 square miles is larger than the states of Texas and Oklahoma combined, flown at a time when Alaska had a fraction of its current radar coverage and almost none of its current satellite communication. Locating a single aircraft inside terrain that size in a range where cloud can erase visibility inside minutes was never a matter of effort alone. And the ridge this camera happened to be flying over in 2025 sits inside a stretch of that same search area that, by the mission logs available today, was covered largely by visual pass rather than any instrument capable of reading temperature through cloud or canopy. Understanding exactly who was aboard that aircraft and why the flight was considered routine before it wasn't matters before anything else about this file makes sense. Hale Boggs had served 14 non-consecutive terms in the House and sat as one of 7 members of the Warren Commission, where he was among its most vocal internal critics of the FBI's handling of evidence. He was, at the time of the flight, House Majority Leader and widely expected to become Speaker. Nick Begich was Alaska's sole member of Congress, a first-term representative running for re-election, well known in the state for the same kind of retail campaigning that had put him on this particular flight. Russell Brown was his aide, traveling with him for a 2-day campaign swing across the state ahead of the November election. Don Johns, the pilot, was an experienced Alaska aviator who had logged extensive hours flying exactly this kind of route in exactly this kind of terrain, in exactly this kind of weather. None of the 4 were amateurs to Alaska flying, and the aircraft itself, a twin-engine Cessna 310, was a standard, well-regarded charter type for the region, in routine service, with no maintenance issues noted before departure. The flight plan called for a routine daytime run from Anchorage to Juneau, a route flown commercially and privately without incident on a near-daily basis by pilots with far less experience than Johns. Weather at departure was poor but within limits. Pilots in this region flew through regularly. Overcast, moderate turbulence expected. Nothing on the forecast that grounded other traffic that morning. Nothing about the morning of October 16, 1972, marked it as different from dozens of similar flights that had come before it, on the same route, in the same kind of weather, without incident. The 9:09 check-in was the last time any of the 4 men were heard from. What the Modern Review eventually cataloged from the 2025 flight amounts to its own inventory, built the way any flagged anomaly on a training sortie gets built, before anyone calls it worth a second look. The first pass, logged at 2:47 p.m., a single bright thermal return on bare rock, no corresponding shape visible on the aircraft's daylight camera, consistent with an object smaller than the sensor's resolution at that altitude. The second pass, 40 minutes later. The same coordinates, the same shape, now measurably cooler than the surrounding stone rather than warmer. The aircraft's own flight log, cross-checked against archived 1972 search grid maps held by the Air Force Rescue Coordination Center. The ridge sits within roughly a mile of the outer edge of the historical search boundary, in a sector the 1972 mission logs mark as covered by visual pass only, never by any instrument capable of reading temperature through the terrain. Weather data for the day, clear skies, light wind, conditions that rule out wind chill or precipitation as the source of the rapid cooling, and a check against the crew's own equipment log, no comparable anomaly logged anywhere else on that sortie, before or after, on a flight that covered dozens of similar ridgelines under identical conditions. And cases like this one, a 50-year file that resurfaces every time equipment capable of reading terrain differently gets flown over the same ground, turn up in archives like this more often than most people watching this would expect. Subscribing with notifications on is the only way to know when the next one gets reviewed and released. Now, back to that ridge above Prince William Sound. None of that effort produced a single confirmed piece of wreckage. After 39 days and more than 3,600 log flight hours across 325,000 square miles, the search was suspended with winter closing in, and the 4 men were declared presumed dead by a state jury on December 29, 1972, at the request of Alaska's governor. The geometry of that failure is its own kind of evidence. A search area larger than many countries, worked by the largest air fleet ever assembled for a single missing aircraft, that still came back with nothing at all. Not a wing panel, not a seat cushion, not a single confirmed fragment in over 5 decades of hunters, hikers, and pilots crossing that same range for entirely unrelated reasons. The federal government's own final position on this file is precise, and it is not a conclusion. The National Transportation Safety Board closed its investigation on January 31, 1973, stating plainly that the available evidence was insufficient to determine a probable cause. It did not rule out mechanical failure. It did not rule out severe icing or turbulence along a mountainous route in poor weather. The theory most aviation investigators still consider the likeliest explanation, given the conditions logged that morning. It simply stated, in the driest possible bureaucratic language, that there wasn't enough physical evidence left to know for certain, and that absent wreckage, no theory could be elevated above any other. No agency since has reopened that finding, revised it, or replaced it with anything more specific, and none has said it plans to based on a single, unconfirmed sensor return. That finding accounts for why this case has stayed classified as unresolved for over 5 decades. It does not account for why the theory persists that the aircraft went down for reasons that had nothing to do with weather at all. One point about this file requires complete transparency, stated exactly where it belongs, and not folded into a closing note. In 1994, a convicted murderer named Jerry Pasley, briefly married to Begich's widow, claimed from jail that the flight had been deliberately brought down. That claim resurfaced publicly through a 2022 investigative podcast that attempted to trace it further, connecting it to organized crime figures with no independent verification offered. It has never been officially confirmed anywhere by any agency, and it has never been corroborated by a second independent source. Even members of the Boggs family writing publicly on the case's 50th anniversary have described that specific claim as full of holes and never substantiated by anyone else. It deserves to be weighed exactly that way, as an unconfirmed claim from a single, uncorroborated source, not as an alternate official finding standing alongside the NTSB's own. The reason that claim found an audience at all has less to do with Alaska and more to do with what Boggs had done 18 months earlier. In the spring of 1971, as the sitting House Majority Leader, Boggs took the floor to accuse the FBI, under Director J. Edgar Hoover, of wiretapping members of Congress, and compared the Bureau's tactics to those of an authoritarian secret police, demanding Hoover's resignation on the floor of the House. He had already been one of the more skeptical voices inside the Warren Commission's own internal review of the FBI's evidence years earlier. A national figure who had just picked a public fight with the most powerful law enforcement official in the country disappearing without a trace 18 months later was never going to be filed away as an ordinary aviation accident by everyone who heard about it, regardless of what the weather logs actually showed. That history is not proof of anything beyond why the rumor had fuel to burn. The documented record and the undocumented theory are 2 separate files, and this account keeps them separate rather than letting one borrow credibility from the other. The pattern that is verifiable and dated is simpler than any of that. 1971, the public break with Hoover. 1972, the disappearance. 1994, an uncorroborated claim from prison that has never been resolved either way, revived again in 2022. None of those three dates explain the ridge above Prince William Sound. What they explain is why, more than 50 years later, a single unexplained thermal return in roughly the right stretch of mountains still gets a second look from a review team instead of a shrug and a note for the file. The pattern is not confined to 1972 either. Alaska's mountains and glaciers continue to surrender wreckage from other unrelated flights on their own schedule, decades after the fact, as ice that once buried metal for good starts moving and melting on a timeline nobody in 1972 could have planned around. That pattern has already played out once elsewhere in this state, with an aircraft that disappeared in circumstances entirely unrelated to this one. In 1952, a military C-124 Globemaster carrying 52 servicemen crashed into Mount Gannett, northeast of Anchorage, and was buried by the glacier beneath it for decades. Portions of the wreckage and the remains of some of those aboard did not begin resurfacing until the ice that had sealed them away started shifting and melting, with additional material still being recovered as recently as 2020, 68 years after the crash. And only because the glacier itself eventually gave up what it had been holding. Nothing that follows is established as fact. It is the only account this single thermal return and the terrain around it actually support, and no more than that. One reading of the file places it like this: a section of aircraft skin or engine housing resting exposed on bare rock just above the snowline, having spent 5 decades buried under seasonal drift before recent. Warmer winters left it uncovered for the first time in living memory. Sun heated during the day the way any dark metal on open rock heats up, it then loses that heat far faster than the granite around it once the sun drops behind the ridge. Read on a sensor as a bright spot that cools on a curve, the surrounding stone simply doesn't share on 2 separate passes, 40 minutes apart. The physical record doesn't move once the alternate readings are set aside. A thermal signature that heats and cools unlike the rocks surrounding it, on 2 passes 40 minutes apart, at fixed coordinates near the edge of the largest search grid in American search and rescue history. No confirmed ground truth yet. No second sensor pass scheduled as of this file's writing. Nothing in the surrounding terrain data that resolves it either way, and nothing ruling out a far more ordinary explanation that simply hasn't been checked on the ground. This channel does not declare the Begich Boggs wreckage found, and it will not pretend a single infrared frame settles what 3,600 flight hours across 325,000 square miles could not. What the record shows is what the record shows, and where the record stops, this account stops with it. Files like this one, a 50-year disappearance that a modern sensor can suddenly read differently than the equipment available at the time, surface out of archives like this one more often than most people expect, and most of them start the same way this one did, as a routine flight, flagged because an operator noticed a curve on a screen that didn't match the rock around it. If you know of a case that belongs in this archive, the comments are usually where it starts. The ridge is still there, still logged, still waiting on a ground team with the right season and the right clearance to reach it. The frame ends. The mountain it's pointed at has been holding its answer since 1972.